The only James. How do you spell your last name?
Dailing. It's Dailing.
James. Do you go by Jimmy mostly?
I'm one of those weird people that goes by pretty much any name. So I know how you know me based off of what you call me.
Oh, like how close?
Yeah, so like Jimmy D is normally people I go to church with or good friends from work. I used to work at the Arsenal, so those people call me Jim. And at John Deere, people call me James. So if I'm out in a crowd and someone hollers my name,
So what do your close friends call you?
Jimmy D.
Well, I got to start calling you Jimmy D then, bro.
I answered everything, so.
I think Jimmy's what I've called you historically.
Yeah, most people go with Jimmy.
Yeah. Well, tell people who you are, kind of what you do. We should probably talk about how we met.
Yeah.
Let's start there, though. What do you do?
I am an IT security analyst at John Deere.
Smart people.
Sounds super fancy, but basically I do application security. So I make sure that we are secure.
Nice.
That we are not prone to attack from outside entities or internal entities that might want to take advantage of
Interesting. I didn't
our
know
infrastructure.
That. Yeah.
So.
That's cool. But also what you do is you're pretty heavily involved in church.
Yep.
You are, is it elder track? Is that what you guys call it?
Yeah, I'm an elder candidate at Sacred City.
Elder candidate at Sacred City, which for those that don't know, Sacred City is the church, my cousin's church, Justin Dean. They have one in Davenport, planted a church in Moline.
Yep. We're over in Bettendorf now, got a new building.
Yep.
Been going to Sacred City for 8 years now.
8 years.
Yeah.
Nice.
So I actually was a part of a church plant, and that church plant was around for probably 5 years. Didn't really see a lot of growth spiritually or numerically, and Sacred City was doing everything we wanted to do. So
Yeah.
I literally left one day, had a conversation with our lead pastor, and then the next week I was at Sacred City.
That's awesome. And what was your role at the church prior to Sacred City?
I was a core planter, so I was an elder of the
Okay.
core team. So there's 3 couples that made up the core team launch.
Yeah.
And we launched out of First Evangelical Free Church in Moline. So we were E-free denomination.
E-free. I don't know much about that denomination. That is one denomination I've spent 0 time on.
E-free Church is really good at...
Sum it up in like 2 sentences. What's an E-free church?
E-free Church would be they're Baptist in their polity. So it's a denomination, but the denomination doesn't have authority over individual churches. So the congregation is the highest level of authority within the local
Similar
church.
to Baptist.
Yeah. And their big thing is they major on the major and minor on the minors.
Okay.
So they have if it's a closed hand issue, they'll fight for it. If it's not a closed hand issue.
So the exact opposite of Sacred City then.
On some levels, I mean, I think actually Sacred City does a pretty good job of finding balance on different things like baptism.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, the one thing that kind of pushed me out of the Free Church was I started to become more all-millennial, and that is one open-handed thing they have closed-handed.
Was eschatology.
Okay. So you had
for those that don't know what that
premillennial.
means, sorry, speaking in terms here, like end of the world, end times theology stuff. So what does it look like when Christ returns? So an amillennial is a position in end times theology.
Yep.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess to clarify, it's what I love about Sacred City and what you guys do is some of the issues that others would call, what's that whole triage, right? Tertiary issues that actually we have come to find out really do matter.
Yeah, I think COVID definitely, all through 2020, kind of made some of these things we didn't think were very big issues.
Yeah.
All of a sudden got pulled to the forefront and
Right.
became massive.
Right.
Major fractions in the foundation
Yeah.
of the church. And it was like, okay, we actually need to talk about some of these things and not just assume
Yeah.
that people know, when it comes to roles of government and
Oh, don't skip ahead. Don't skip ahead.
Okay,
We're not there yet. I was going to say this
Get
could
too
very
excited.
easily roll into our conversation.
It could.
So we met down at the cigar lounge, down at the drawing room. If you also don't know, this guy's like a cigar expert. He's the guy that you want to ask, hey, what should I smoke
I know
today?
a lot about cigars, yeah.
Yeah. And that's how we met. We've gotten into a lot of awesome conversations, and it's like, you know what? I want this guy on my podcast. So the thing that we're going to talk about today, which I'm excited about, I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I think this is a really timely conversation, is how we as Christians should approach this political season, politics in general, the election coming up. We have dealt in the last 2 elections with a very divisive, something that you and I have not seen in our lifetime.
No.
And I think it would be helpful if we just kind of talked and discussed. We have no plan, no itinerary. We're just going to discuss it. How we should approach this season as Christians. So, where do you want to start?
I think the best place to start is probably like what is kind of a foundational view a Christian should have toward politics. Because as soon as you start getting into individual candidates and parties, emotions, background, all that stuff can kind of play into it.
Yeah.
So I think it's best to kind of ground yourself, like, how as a Christian should I look at politics?
Yeah.
Then as you start to enter into all those other conversations, it helps, maybe keep your boat a little more stable instead of getting tossed to and fro as you get into it.
So foundationally, it's really hard to answer that question without discussing eschatology a little bit.
Yeah, that definitely has a big part of it.
Right. Flesh that out a little bit.
Without getting into a bunch of tangents on eschatology, to me, at the end of the day, Jesus wins. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is in control. And so I think that is from any eschatology, that's what you have to have in mind when you're going into politics. Because politics can seem like it's its own authority. Like that government is its own authority, and you read a lot of that in the Founding Fathers, and what they were trying to get across is that if you view government as the ultimate authority, you are going to have all kinds of issues that spin out from that.
Yeah.
And if God is the ultimate authority, and that government is put in place by God for a reason, that it is still under the authority of God, right? It is not ultimate.
I think that was beat into our heads as kids. I mean, the separation of church and state, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's just been beat into us. Like, hey, we're going to be the church over here. Government's going to be over here. Let's not get too involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it spins into all kinds of different areas, not even politics. Because we heard that so much, we feel that way about our personal views, period. Whether it's work, whether it's, in your local Rotary Club, your neighborhood, family.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people that, like, at family, it's like, well, you don't talk about politics. And what they're really getting at is you individually can't put your view on other people, which at the end of the day is nonsense, because all politics is the views of people put on other people.
Yeah. It's funny that it was actually taken, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't think I'm wrong on this, but the separation of church and state was to keep the government out of religion, not religion out of government.
Yeah. Fundamentally, what I would boil it down to, in my understanding of reading Federalist Papers, Jefferson's letters, things like that, it all comes down to the fact that what the Founding Fathers were trying to stop was a church that was endorsed by the state, like you have in Europe.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And you even see in some of the colonies early on, some of the early states, they did have, like, there was a heavy influence of the church into politics in the state level.
Yeah.
And the Founding Fathers didn't have a problem with that. I think it was, what they were really trying to avoid was that kind of linked up government church, because the church doesn't flourish and doesn't function the way it's designed when it's tied into politics.
Yeah, I think, yes. And what I also think people really need to understand is there is no such thing as policy that isn't driven by religion or some type of worldview.
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Like it could be we worship ourselves. It could be there's some things fundamental underneath policy, underneath government. So to say, hey, we want a political whatever, we want a government that is not driven by anything that is religious, doesn't exist.
Correct. Because whatever your viewpoint is religious to you. It's a faith to you, right? So whether you are atheist, agnostic, secular humanist, you have tenets that you believe that you're bringing in, and what ends up happening is you can't bring yours in because yours are religious based. And it's like, yeah, but you have all the keys of a religion. You just don't. It's not a typical, divine religion, right? In the sense that
it's unorganized.
And so
yeah, I think that's important for people to understand. So, what's fundamental you think that believers, like, how should they think about government? And let's flesh out a little bit more in layman's terms, right? Without using too much theology talk about eschatology and everything else. What should believers think about government?
I really think it's the founding fathers had these things in mind when they started working on putting this country together. So for me, I think government's role is, and I've been touched by libertarianism quite a bit.
Yeah.
And even though some of that I've been maturing in that, and actually some of my libertarian leanings have been challenged recently. That's still kind of my default base that I operate out of. So for me, I would say government is there to ensure that individuals are kind of like the weights and measures in the Old Testament, that the individuals are upholding contracts, that they're not taking advantage of each other, like legally.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're in business and you're selling gasoline, but you're loading up your tank, so it looks like I get more gas than I am when I'm in a contract with you.
Yeah.
Things like that. Think enforcing, business relationships between employees and companies to a certain extent.
Should a Christian want it to be Christian?
Want the government to be Christian?
No. I think this is the Christian nationalism question a little bit.
Correct. Right? Yeah, for sure. And I think the answer has to be yes. That where people start getting antsy is like, well, what does that mean? Right. So does that mean that we need to actually enforce biblical laws?
Yeah.
And I think that's an area we can get into, but I think
it does matter though, because it matters. It definitely matters when you're choosing a candidate.
For sure.
Like if your aim is, and mine definitely would be, I'll just be honest. When people say, do you believe in Christian nationalism? I'm like, well, what other type of nationalism do you want me to believe in if it's not Christian?
Yeah.
What other type of government?
Well, that's important because I think the lie that I'm an 80s baby, right?
Yep.
So I grew up in kind of that, I think the peak of Americana.
Yep. Right?
Cold War, Rocky, Ivan Drago,
Yep.
Red Dawn, that kind of environment. And I think one of the lies that we were taught that I think still permeates most of the way we think now is exactly what you're pointing out, which is we were told this fairy tale that government is benign.
Yeah.
Right? That it is
that it's neutral.
Yeah. Yep. That there is no bias to government.
Yep.
And only when it's super egregious, then we go, as a church, we go, oh, that's, okay, that crossed the line.
Yeah.
That crossed the neutral zone.
Yeah. Which goes back to what I was saying about religion, because listen, if autonomy and self-worship is our religion, right? Liberalism, or I want my own rights to make my own choices, if that is the God we're worshiping, that religion leads to egregious sin, such as abortion. Yep. Right? That's one giant issue that we always talk about. So that's what I say. I love that we both said neutral at the same time. There's no such thing as a neutral government.
Yeah.
That has no religious underpinnings. There's a moral system behind it, and what is that system? And as a believer, to say, oh, well, you can't be a Christian nationalist. You hear that. It's like, you are the worst of the worst. You're trying to be like Constantine and kill people, which people misunderstand that whole thing too.
Yep.
But, right, of course, as a Christian, we know that the law of God is where a people will thrive and flourish, where evil will be held back. So to say I want to be a Christian and not want a Christian nation, it makes no logical sense to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, even Christians, will take it to the point where, well, then all you really want is Israel, right? Israel was an example of a nation with certain moral laws, and I think it's a misnomer, because I think as Christians what we have to do is we have to look at the Old Testament and not just use it as a blueprint where we just slap it onto whatever nation we're in.
Yeah.
But we need to drive out the principles that were behind that, because there are some things that would not be appropriate for a Christian nation under the
Can you think of any?
Like some of the dietary laws would be the first thing I would think of.
Yeah.
Right, where we're not going to be like, okay, nobody can eat lobster.
Like the ceremonial.
Ceremonial laws. I think it's best to focus on the moral law, right? What are the principles we can draw out of that? Yeah. But even when COVID came around, I remember the opposite of the biblical principle of quarantine happened, which was, okay, everybody stays home even if you're healthy. Yep. And it's like, well, there's a biblical principle there around quarantine where sick people are quarantined. Mm-hmm. So for the government to come around and say, hey, if you have X, Y, or Z, don't leave your house, I think as a Christian I could have been like, yeah, great. When it turned into, okay, nobody leaves their house, and now we're 3 years post-COVID, and we see the ramifications of what happened when you shut down an entire country. And don't even think of it as an entire country. When we shut down your community, when we shut down your churches, when we shut down, and we got a pretty light dose of it in Iowa.
Oh yeah, real
compared
light.
To some other places. I remember being on a phone call with a guy in Boston. He broke down and cried on the call because I was in my office on this video call, and he was like, I haven't left my apartment for a year.
Yeah.
He's like, my dog goes to the bathroom in a little tub I have right here.
Yeah, we had churches out in Seattle, man. It was the same thing.
Yeah.
Just intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so again, to help the believer think through this, I do think they need to think in terms of, we want or desire a Christian nation because we want people to thrive. We want sin to be held back and resisted. But also I want people to understand that being a Christian nation, there is no compulsion in true Christianity.
Yep.
So when I say a Christian nation, that actually means that you will have freedom to worship something else.
Yep.
People don't understand that as well.
Correct.
They think, a Christian nation means that everyone is forced to be Christian and worship God. Mm-hmm. Well, no. It means that we're going to use the moral law, which most people already adhere. We can get into natural law too, right?
Yeah, I mean, so our justice system used to be based on the moral law.
Right.
Which is, here's another example of this kind of creeping in where I think Christians kind of gave up a fight that was helpful for humans, not just Christians. 10 Commandments in courthouses. So the 10 Commandments is an encapsulation of the moral law.
10 Commandments on our public school walls. Yeah. That was when I was in school.
Regardless of your background, who has a problem with the 10 Commandments?
Don't kill people.
Don't steal, don't kill people, don't try and take your neighbor's stuff.
Yeah.
Don't covet, your neighbor's wife or your husband's wife or whatever. Yeah. But then where you start to see people kind of is when it's like, you shall have no other God before me.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
When you start getting those vertical commandments, that's where people start going, well, I don't know, that's where it's religious and we should pull it out. But again, there's principles there.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to do a better job of extrapolating out biblical principles and then understanding how they tie into every policy.
Yeah.
Right? Everything that comes through your local state house, the federal state house, they all they are all hitting something in a biblical principle.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing we've kind of lost as Christians, is that we view, again, like the big issues but we don't view like, well, who cares about, our budget this year for the state of Iowa or our federal budget this year?
Yeah.
Well, there's biblical principles on finances.
Absolutely.
And, so I think that's where you run into kind of the fighting against some of the lies that we've just kind of been taught and we're just assumed.
Yeah.
And
it's an interesting thought. What does our country look like right now if we use the moral law as our law?
I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is the crazy videos that you see in like California where people will I just saw a video yesterday. This dude walked into an Apple store and I mean, in a matter of like 40 seconds, stole.
I saw that. He's like ripping cords off.
Dude, he stole like 12 iPhones,
I saw
right?
that.
And everyone's just standing there. And I would say that is legislation that is harming society.
Yeah.
Because even if they weren't your iPhones and it's just some big corporation and they can pay for it, at the end of the day, from a safety standpoint, I doubt anybody was in that store going, man, I feel so safe right now.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a trust we have in each other that gets eroded by poor laws.
Yeah.
And unbiblical laws, right?
Yeah.
And that's where you have kind of a psychological aspect to it.
Yeah.
You have a retail aspect to it. You have a neighborhood aspect to it.
Yeah.
Like, at the end of the day, let's say that wasn't an iPhone or an Apple store. It was somebody's bodega that they've spent 35 years working on.
Side point and totally kind of irrelevant to our conversation, but they talked about that guy's not very smart for stealing iPhones because
I was thinking that.
He has no chance of ever using one of those iPhones.
Yeah. He'll still probably sell them on Facebook to somebody.
Right? No, but also, I mean, think about if we're a Christian nation using God's moral standard for our laws, pornography is outlawed. Think about the giant problem that is in our country.
Yeah.
And I always wonder, people that aren't believers in Christianity, do you really hate this world that I paint here if we're using Christian morals? Pornography is outlawed. Even people that aren't believers I've talked to, they hate the fact that they're addicted to pornography.
Yeah.
Homosexuality, it's not considered a marriage, but does that mean that we're telling you can't live with someone, that you can't enjoy a life with someone? We'll call it sin. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
But you don't get to redefine marriage. My point is, does our world really look that bad?
Well, and
I
think that goes into kind of the idea of sphere sovereignty, right? So you have government or civil, you have the family, and then you have the church. Mm. And whether you're a Christian or not, you have an authority in your home, right?
Yep.
So at the end of the day, I would say the government does not have the right to go into your family and go, hey, you need to do X, Y, or Z in your house.
Right.
Just like the church doesn't have an authority to go into your house and say, you need to do X, Y, or Z. So even for non-Christians, homosexual relationships, what you're doing in your house it's a moot point.
Right.
Now, when you come out in public and have conversations, you might get pushback from the Christian community saying, well, we don't think this is the best way for human flourishing to take place.
Right. Oh, and also we don't want to be forced to celebrate it in your parades, right?
Yeah.
So I just think that people don't really stop and think about what does a world actually look like if it is Christian.
I think you can get a glimpse of what it looks like because everything that we have in a Western culture, I don't think most people understand those things don't come without a Christian worldview, period.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we are standing on the rubble
shoulders
of things that would not be here without Christianity anyway, like equal treatment of men and women, right? That was non-existent prior to Christianity. That was a Christian idea. We've never even had, apart from Christianity, a government that actually served people and wasn't oppressive.
Right.
And so we stand on the ruins of Christianity or Christendom, right? And we don't even know it. We we think, and I'm talking culturally as like Americans, we think that those things have been around forever, right?
Yep.
Like those are just ideas humans have always had, and it's like, no, those are not ideas humans have always had. Those ideas come from Christianity.
Amen. Yes. I know. That's such a great point. And I always try to tell people that, like, we wouldn't be having these discussions had it not been for Christianity.
Exactly.
The freedoms that it provides for people. Like I said, there's no compulsion. If Christianity is running our country, they're not making you do certain things. They're giving you freedom with it, right?
Well, and this is another tangent, but that's what was so striking to me during COVID, was COVID happens, and to me, that would have been the moment for the Christian church to shine in a way that we hadn't had the opportunity to do since the plague.
In what way?
Well, in the sense of like, so during the Great Plague, like one of the reasons Christianity in the Roman Empire rose to the level it did was because Christians were selfless and they would risk their own lives. So people would throw their babies out on the street because they had the plague, and Christians would rescue those children,
right,
knowing that there is a good chance they're probably going to get the plague. But that's where orphanages came from.
Yep.
That's where, and so the fact that we should value our life less than our fellow man, or that we should be willing to give up our life in pursuit of honoring God and pursuing what's righteous and what's good.
Yeah.
I think that during COVID was something I didn't see that made me go, why aren't we doing this as a church? Yeah. Like this is a gap that we have nowadays compared to the lineage that we come from.
Yeah. Well, now that we've kind of discussed our thoughts on just government in general, how do people think about this coming election cycle? What issues do you think are most important? How do they think about Biden? How do they think about Trump? And if you don't mind, like, what do you think through about how you vote? Like, what are the primary issues for you?
I think for me, as a Christian, policy matters. So I think the easiest person to get into this conversation with is Trump.
Yeah.
Because Trump is the first candidate where it was like nobody believed his policy, right? Until he actually got elected. So that's why he picked Mike Pence as his vice president, because he didn't have the Christian kind of cohort behind him. Yep. But he was also the first politician where policy potentially could be trumped by personality. So for me, I would always say policy is first. Like what laws, what initiatives, what change is actually going to come from this person?
And I'm going to pause you there for a second because I think that's a super important point. How many people do you think personality becomes before policy?
Oh, I would say the vast majority of people vote on personality.
It feels that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Who's the most polished? I mean, this is why we see Obama just, so many people, huge fans of Obama. He's polished. He plays the part. He looks well. Why can't people see
He's
through those
presidential.
facades?
I mean, that's what presidential means, right?
Right.
Is he has the personality. He has the demeanor, or she. But
I don't know. Biden's pretty polished. Sorry. That's mean. Used to be.
He used to be, yeah. I mean, I remember Biden back when he was in the Senate, and Biden was always, that Uncle Joe. Like, he knew how to connect to people. He knew how to tell stories, make people feel related to him. All politicians do that. That's what they do.
Yeah.
That's why I think a lot of really solid people will never be politicians.
Yeah.
Because can you be someone who affects change in a positive way for the people of this country and also be like, listen, I don't want to go to all 99 counties in Iowa and shake everybody's hand and like, can I just run for office, serve the people, do good, and then go away?
Yep.
Right?
I feel bad for the guy at this point, though. I feel like his party's pushing. I honestly think if I got him in a room by himself, I'm like, bro, do you really want to do this? He can hardly talk.
Yeah, I think there's definitely the cognitive aspect of where Biden's at right now, I think is, I don't think he should be there. But
I don't think a lot of people in his own party think he should be there.
yeah, I would agree.
Which
I
is
don't know who would look at him cognitively right now
right.
and go, "Oh, I feel like he's going to do a good job."
But to be fair, I think a lot of people in the Republican Party would say the same thing about Trump, right?
Oh, for sure.
They don't want him to be their representative, which is just a fascinating place to be as a country. Having two candidates that no one really wants. I guess that's not true. Trump has a cult following. But.
Yeah, there's tons of people that want Trump, for sure.
So anyway, back to working through like what you think about.
Yeah, so policy's definitely number one for me. Personality, I would say until Trump really didn't factor into it for me. I mean, I've voted for some stale people before that had the right policies.
Yep.
I helped out Alan Keyes back in the day when he ran against Obama for Illinois Senate. Alan Keyes was, policy-wise, I agreed with him on everything. He was a kind of an aristocrat, so like he just didn't get a lot of that personal buy-in from people because he kind of seemed stiff and
kind of stale,
a little wooden. But Trump's problem, in my opinion, is that his personality sometimes can outweigh his policy. And that's where you have a lot of people, I think, that sit on the fence with Trump. And they go, policy-wise, I agree with him. I can't agree with almost anything that comes out of his mouth.
Yeah.
Or at least the tone in which he says it.
Right.
And I don't want to dismiss that either. Like, to me, that's something that I had to kind of walk through and go, at the end of the day, if I had to boil it all down, do I think that who you are is actually important? Yes.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, as a Christian voting, I don't walk into that ballot box and go, I can only vote for a Christian.
Yeah.
Now, I've had this debate with other people before, but I don't think just because someone says they're a Christian means they're a Christian. Now I can magically vote for them.
Right.
And
what do you mean, man? He had Paula White in his corner. He's a Christian. Sorry.
He had a lot of Christians in his corner, and rightfully so. I'm not even going after people that supported him because I supported him. I think I support him for different reasons.
Yeah.
I support him because I think he's a bull in a china shop. And I think that he will.
And things need to be stirred up.
Exactly. I think certain things need to be broken. Here's a good example. I was a Ron Paul guy.
Yep.
I was a Rand Paul guy until Trump destroyed him in the primary. But one thing I always would tell people when I would talk to them about politics is I'd say the problem with like Ron Paul back in the day was he's too principled. So Ron Paul will never violate his principles to actually enact his principles.
Right.
Which sounds good, right? Like I would want someone who wouldn't violate the things that they believe to do things. But I think the problem is on certain levels, there's so much ingrowing in the government. There's so many things that are kind of twisted together and knotted up and tied together that I think you have to be willing to maybe stretch some things to break them.
I think
so that you can remake them.
That's a principle in life in general, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Always playing polite, nice, passive guy oftentimes doesn't get the job done.
Yeah, look at it, and I do a lot of gardening at home.
Yep.
Look at it as like an overgrown hedge.
Yeah.
Like you can be upset that the hedge is overgrown and, well, we got to trim it way back and we're going to make this thing look ugly because we got to trim it so much. But 4 years later, you now have a beautiful hedge instead of this ingrown, gnarled up, just kind of row of plants that, looks horrible.
Yeah, I think people often take this verse and use it too much, or the passage. But I mean, there was a context in which Jesus did flip tables. Trump may walk around flipping tables. That may be the side he errs on. But the point is, at times, you've got to break your character to get something done and accomplished.
Yep. Now that this is the other side of the sword that I think sometimes people that support Trump are blind to, and I think people that maybe not are full in, like, I think Biden's the greatest, but they're weary of Trump, is that the person that breaks it, you have to have enough faith in that person that they can actually fix it correctly.
Right.
Right? And that's where, to me, a guy like a Rand Paul or Ron Paul, you want that principal guy in there to go, actually, Congress is only going to get laws put in front of them now that are no more than a page so they can actually read them. Yeah. And there's no more earmarks, and there's no more, and we're going to do it through the legislature, not through an executive order, so that it actually becomes a law that can't just get overturned at the whims of the president.
Yeah.
Will Trump be the guy that does that? I don't think so.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that. I don't put that much faith in any president. Trump's not fixing anything for me permanently, right? He's in there for 4 years. What I think about when I'm voting is trajectory, mm-hmm. right? What is going to put us on the right trajectory in terms of family, worship? The only way we fix our country is to disciple the nation, right? And I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, that's where you get into like the county over country movement.
Yeah.
And the idea that gridlock is always this bad thing. It's actually, I think it's wonderful. Our system was designed to be gridlock.
Yeah.
Our system on the federal level is designed so the president didn't have that much power. Like even the title president is the lowest title of executive that you can give somebody. Which I thought was interesting. That like
king being number one?
Well, like king and, the magistrate, all these different names. Like at the time, president was like the one with the least amount of gravitas.
Right.
So like even our founding fathers in the title of the executive wanted to denote there is not a lot of power here. There shouldn't be a lot of power here. And I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
The federal government should not have that much impact on your life.
Right.
The president should not have that much impact on your life. And I think as Christians, a lot of times we get enamored with, the District 13 or District 1 idea, and we're in District 13 to go to Hunger Games.
Hunger Games, yeah.
Where it's just this far-off place of, just grandeur where they watch over us and they make these decisions. And really, I think Christians are called to be here locally where you're at. Like, be more focused on, who your county board members are, who your state representatives are.
Yeah.
And
that's that whole county over country thing. And I think that's super important. Yeah.
So if you go vote for president, but you didn't go vote for Scott County Board, I think that's something as a Christian you should examine.
And just to kind of keep hashing that out a little bit with Trump, I want people to understand there's a lot of people that literally buy into like this guy is sent from God. Mm-hmm. So, and I guess I can't say that can't be used from God to put us on a better trajectory. I think there may be an argument for that. I don't know that I believe that. I'm just saying I can see that argument.
Yeah.
But man, people are just about worship the guy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, in our own church, I've had some pretty robust dialogues with people that literally kind of have that Trump worship idea. And oddly enough, my critique and my pushback to them is the same for people that are on the other side, which is, listen, at the end of the day, Jesus is Lord right now. Like, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father. And he works all things together. Yep. He holds everything together through his power.
Yep.
That whoever is the president is there at the behest of God. Yep. God moves him like a stream where he wants him to go. Mm. So regardless of who is in office, I think the Christian posture is, what are we supposed to do under this person, and how are we supposed to honor this person as the civil magistrate?
Mm. Yeah. So keep going with policy you said over personality. What policies, if you don't mind me asking, which ones are most important to you?
I would say this is where I think Calvin teaches people a lot on economics. We think of Calvin as, kind of the tulip guy.
Yep.
But actually, I've heard a lot of historians say They feel like that's actually Calvin's like weakest thing in the Christian institutes.
Really?
That his economics is literally what transformed Western culture.
Wow.
And his understanding of what we would call capitalism, free market economics. So for me, that's kind of that's the vein I operate out of, is
primary
understanding the best way for humans to flourish is to have biblical principles applied to all aspects of life, so civil, church, family, and then even if you are not a Christian, you will benefit from the overflowing of those principles being in place, because God puts those in place for human flourishing, not for dominion and like snuffing us under a boot and keeping us, squashed. And so when you really believe that, then it starts to kind of open up this idea of like limited government, right? So the more we as people are able to transact, interact, communicate without influence from other authorities, the better that is. Then you can apply that into businesses, and not just me and you, but now you own a business and I'm interacting with your business. Well, how do those principles apply to business? So I think from an economic standpoint, limited government is a big thing. Then you get into, I think the biggest sticking point, if you want to go to what I think one of the biggest issues is, I've had this discussion with a lot of Christians, is like social programs, because what a lot of Christians end up doing is they go, well, I read my Bible, I see we're supposed to take care of widows and orphans, and so I think it's a good thing that we as a society take our tax money and we,
give it out.
We have all these programs. And my pushback from a Christian standpoint, from a principle standpoint on that would be, I agree that we are called to do that as the church, but the state is not called to do that. And to our shame as the Christian church, we are not doing that because the government does it now. And so if you go back to even 100 years ago, I remember listening to Urim Brooks talk about this from the Ayn Rand Institute. He talked about how, like, if you went to New York City, there would be like insurance policies for communities. So like you as a neighborhood, you would get together and you would say, hey, and that's where a lot of like names come from for neighborhoods. And we would get together as, the 3500 block, and we would have the 3500 block insurance policy.
Interesting.
So anyone within our neighborhood was a part of this, and we as a community would actually like support each other. And then you had your local churches that would take care of the homeless, and our resources would go there. But I think the big things Christians miss when it comes to this point is Jesus commands us to do it, not to give it to somebody else to do it. And I think the biggest reason is he's trying to change our heart and get us to understand something about our brother when we actually have to give of our time and resources, when we have to go feed the homeless, when we have to be with the least of these. Whereas when we just shop it off to the government to do it, there's all kinds of biblical principles about understanding where that money is going, understanding the person you're giving it to, and how they're utilizing it, whether it's being abused. And so that's, I think, I get into that sticking point a lot with Christians, is because they're like, well, it seems like a loving thing to do. And I'm like, it is a loving thing for us to do.
Right. That's really good. I've never heard capitalism fleshed out that well. I mean, down to like morally.
Yeah, I think I did a horrible job at it, but I'm glad you liked it.
You did better than I could have done at it.
I feel like I'm swimming in the shallow end of the pool.
I mean, this is a giant topic, and to be honest with you, I feel super uneducated on a lot of it, but it's that's really, really insightful.
Yeah, David Bonson's podcast. If you listen to any of David Bonson's stuff,
who's he through?
So his dad was like a really popular apologist back in the 70s-ish, Greg Bonson. So David Bonson he lives in Manhattan and he owns a hedge fund, but he's like a solid Christian. Right. And so when he does, he gets into these economic talks about like your Christian faith, and this guy will talk about things that I think most Christians probably are like, I've never even thought of that before. And so Bonson was really helpful in kind of pointing out a lot of the economics of Christianity.
Yeah.
And so,
And I guess that's what I don't hear talked about a whole lot. I hear a lot about, right, sexual ethics and that kind of thing, but I don't on the podcast in the circles that I swim in, but I don't hear a lot of people talk about the economics and just how much that drives so much of what you talk about.
yeah. Well, and at the end of the day, I think the problem is, again, we get distracted by what they want us to get distracted by sometimes, right?
Yeah.
The big things, the things that are super important. And it's like, those things are important, but I feel like if you have human flourishing through an economic system that is biblically based, all of a sudden it opens up the capacity for people to go, well, what is wrong with a Christian government? I have a great job and I can trust my neighbors, and when I go to a business, I can believe what they're telling me. And
Yeah, and that Tom Holland, are you familiar with Tom Holland, the historian out of the UK?
I've heard of him. I thought you were
wrote
talking about Spider-Man, but
Yeah, right. But he wrote the book Dominion. Anyway, he's an unbeliever, but he's one of those historians that's like, hey, guys, if you don't see the good that Christianity's done for the world, you're blind. Like, you need to understand, like, I'm all for Christianity flourishing because this creates the best cultures. So yeah, to your point, I mean, I think that if people would really open their eyes and realize it's not as bad as they think it is. So economics being one that drives. So when you think through that policy-wise, that would be a more Republican stance historically.
yeah, I would say it's, and our labels for politics is so screwed
I know.
up nowadays.
I'm just saying when you're voting, though, right?
Traditionally, people would say that's a Republican view.
Right.
I would say it's also a classic liberal view. So that confuses people sometimes when
Yep.
I think it's actually become, with like the woke movement, I think it's become more defined of like a classical liberal versus a progressive.
Right.
And
But for the layperson watching,
yeah,
when you're voting this year, that is one point the Republican Party.
kind of. Yeah. So for the layman, this is the problem.
Yep.
Both parties are horrible.
Agreed.
Right. So it's what I laid out there is not a Republican.
They're not doing that.
They're not doing it. Right.
But are they doing it better than? And I'm not trying to back you into a corner. I'm honestly curious.
In theory, yes, but they're not. Right. So
then it's
look
not.
at look
It's
at
not
the
a
federal
voting
budget for this year. All they're arguing about is Republicans aren't small government. They just argued for 1.5 billion less
Yeah.
than the Democrat Party did. So both parties are not in line with Christian principles. So then it gets down to, well, which is better? And I think that's where social issues come in.
So then, although that's a foundational issue for you,
Yep.
it's kind of laid aside a little bit because neither party's doing it well.
Yep.
Interesting. I didn't know you were going to say that.
I didn't know I was going to say that until I said it. No.
No. So, okay. Yeah, that is a fascinating.
But I think that's why it amps up social issues so much. So if they cancel each other out economically,
Yeah.
so now I'm like, okay, well, economics doesn't play into who I'm voting for necessarily. I think there are other things economically can play into that. Tax cuts. Like a big thing right now everyone's talking about is, this is the first time I've owed money to the IRS. Well, yeah, because Trump put tax cuts in place. But they weren't tax cuts that went through the system the way they should and all this stuff and became a law. It's all this grandfathered stuff that in 4 years this expires and that, you know. So it's like there are other economical impacts. Taxes
Yeah.
would be probably a big one to consider. Red tape when it comes to businesses. Trump
Yeah.
a lot of regulations and stuff around small businesses. But I definitely think it levels the playing field, and then some of those other issues become more important, like social issues.
Right. So then, although it's a primary, I'm just trying to help the person listening. Although it's a primary issue for you, it's not one that really fleshes itself out in the two parties that we have right now.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Someone asked me, and just to kind of steer off a little bit, hey, Josiah, if you were to say it's easy to pick apart from a Christian perspective what's wrong with the Liberal Party, what's wrong with the Democratic Party. But they asked me, hey, what do you see that's wrong with the Republican Conservative Party? And I want you to tail off here a little bit and answer that question. But for me, it is, they seem to be not unified on what they're actually conserving. I think that's a problem. You and I conserve a biblical, right, foundation. That's what we're aiming at. I think a lot of Republicans are aiming at 1950. I think a lot of them are confused on what exactly they're conserving, because an interesting illustration that actually Doug Wilson used, and this one stuck with me. But you see the Daily Wire promoting their new razors with scandalous dressed women. Mm-hmm. And immediately, Doug's like, oh, they're woke. And it's funny to say that, because the rest of the world would look at Daily Wire and be like, they're woke? That is like the conservative platform that everyone's listening to.
Yeah.
But to you and I, yeah, they are liberal in that sense, right? They are not conserving the same ethics that you and I are conserving. I think a lot of Christians think, oh, to be Republican is to be Christian.
Yeah, or to be conservative is to be Christian.
Right.
And I think that was that was really galvanized under George W. Bush. Like, George W. Bush took that as his mantra, like compassionate conservatism. That's the Christian way. He had that big faith movement where he tried.
Maybe that's where that was so ingrained in me.
Yeah, where he was trying to tie faith-based, like the government can do faith-based things, and but yeah, I think for me it's been very clear to me, and I had to learn this, is that conservative does not mean Christian. Conservative doesn't mean ally for my worldview, right? So I think sometimes you can hear conservative and you go, oh, well, this person, even if they're not a Christian conservative or they're not a Christian nationalist or whatever title you want to put on it, they'll still be aligned with me on some things.
Yeah.
And frankly, you know what those things normally are is economic things. They're not aligned on social issues for the most part.
Yeah.
And that's why it's not as simple as like, well, these people line up here and these people line up here. There's so many division lines that that I just don't think we're aware of, that sometimes we'll partner with people and then all of a sudden something comes up like COVID and you're like, maybe we're not as aligned as I thought we were.
Right. Yeah. So kind of keep fleshing out. So you said when you're voting, number one is policy. You talked about capitalism versus socialism. But then you said this is where you get into more, what'd you call it? Moral issues or sexual ethics or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So would that be the primary thing you're voting on then? Yeah,
for me. For me, it comes down to social issues for the most part.
Social issues, yeah. That was the term I was looking for.
Yeah.
And which issues are they?
Well, again, there's so much, and maybe I do a disservice by putting so much nuance into all this stuff.
Yeah.
I've had people that are like, I just
you
just
are a
black
nuanced
and white.
guy for
it's
sure.
Like,
Yeah.
But take abortion, for example, right? The Republican Party is not anti-abortion.
Yeah.
So they are not abolitionists. Mm-hmm. They just want less abortion than Democrats, but that doesn't necessarily mean no abortion.
Right.
So if you vote Republican thinking, oh, they're going to end abortion, that's not true. That's not true. For example, someone that I found very interesting in the last election was Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard, on a lot of social things like free speech, like I agreed with her on, and she was the most moderate Democrat on the stage when it came to abortion. So she felt, I believe her stance was, she was fine with first term, but after first term, she didn't think you should be able to abort a child, which is, okay, so now there's some nuance. She's actually in alignment with a lot of Republicans. But there's also Republicans that are more to left on her on that issue. And so I think that's where you have to start taking the whole person into kind of your purview and start examining all their policies. And so for Trump would be a good example where I think Trump actually he's kind of waffled on this, and this is the other problem with politicians is they'll change their mind on things. I would say in his first term, he was actually an abolitionist in the sense of like
Yeah.
completely get rid of abortion. And now I feel like he's actually kind of moved more to the middle on it. And that could be a political play, right? He sees some of the angst with Roe v. Wade being overturned, and he's kind of like, I'm going to hedge my bet against some of this anger that's going to come and could, influence the election. But, yeah, that's just one example of you can't just assume a party believes something.
You can't, but I think a lot of people after Trump's last term, when he put the judge in, that ended up overturning Roe v. Wade. I think that was a big deal for a lot of Christians.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So it wasn't really policy that was put in place, but it was the fact, hey, he instated 2 jurors that, I mean, no one saw that coming, flipping Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
So still you would say, Trump's going to be more conservative on the issue of abortion than Biden would be. I mean, Biden makes
Absolutely.
it. Yeah, it's like a staple thing, like he wants.
Yeah.
So still an issue worth voting for.
Yep. Then you can get into some other social issues. Like, I've actually softened quite a bit on this. I used to be super conservative, and I feel like I'm more biblical now, conservative, which is a good thing.
That's good.
But like when it comes to like drug laws,
Oh, okay.
like
I was wondering what you were going to say.
I think it is. I do think it's crazy that it's like, oh, you got popped with like 3 grams of weed on a street corner and you're in prison for 40 years.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, and maybe that's where some of that libertarian comes out in me. It's like, listen, again, without coercion, you're a grown adult. You can make your own decisions. Now, I think where I would then follow up with that is then you also deal with your consequences for being adult and having autonomy to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Whereas right now we have all these systems that kind of rush in from a government perspective.
Yeah, you have to wonder what it looks like if all drugs were legalized. Would it cost the country more money, more resources than it does now?
Yeah, in our current state it would for sure.
You think it would cost more money?
I think it would, yeah.
If it was legal?
Because we have systems all over the place to take care of it on every level, like local, state, federal. And I think if you open it up, and I'm not advocating, I don't think like heroin should be illegal.
I thought that's where you were going.
That's not where I was going. That's where a lot of libertarians want to go. But
okay, but so you're not going there.
Yeah.
We do have, I'll tell you, we run Covenant House, right? We deal with addiction a lot. And although we have programs, I will tell you they're not robust. They would be what I would call bare minimum. What do we do with this guy that is completely, cracked out on the side of the street?
Yep.
We shove him in a place for 14 days and we let him back go. And it's a cyclical over and over. I mean, a lot of these guys have been in detox centers 40 times.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So anyway, where were you going to go with it?
I was just going to go to the idea, and I think I'm still open to this, and I think it's a conversation. I think a lot of these conversations just actually Christians need to have.
Yeah.
So that we can actually help each other. Iron sharpens iron, right?
Learn, yeah.
Like we can walk through these things and have these conversations and think about them before they happen. Because I think that's where COVID caught us off guard, was we hadn't talked about a lot of these things. So then when it happened, it was like we have no bearings at all of how we should handle this. Whereas, yeah, let's have conversations. Let's be open to what we're thinking, what the scripture says,
right.
What other brothers and sisters have as far as input, and then try to come up with a biblical ethos. That
so what was your thing?
I'm 43 years old now, Josiah, so sometimes I just talk when I forget what my thing was.
You were talking about
It'll come back to me.
Your libertarian beliefs in regards to drugs.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think ultimately, from a Christian perspective, I think that's where the discussion of human flourishing comes in. So that's where, to me, religion does need to influence the laws around what an adult can do.
Oh, okay.
Because there is this aspect of, yes, you have freedom, you're free from coercion, like the church isn't going to come in and say, this is how you run your house and this is what you do in your house and all these things.
Yeah.
But then there's also a principle of human flourishing from a cultural standpoint. So I think that's where that discussion needs to happen on marijuana, heroin.
So it would be stricter drug laws then.
Potentially. I think it could be looser in some things and and tighter in other things. So
yeah.
But we can't be afraid of that. That's the problem is our dialogue on everything's a political issue now.
Yep.
But our dialogue has shrunk so much on political issues that we can't have conversations that are hard and nuanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do I think we should be able to have people smoke weed if they want to? Sure. Do I think people should be able to have heroin on the corner? No. Well, how do you... Yeah, let's talk about working out. Let's figure out what that looks like.
Right.
And then we come to a consensus, which is something we are desperately in need of, is this idea of let's talk out these ideas. Yeah. I think biblical principles, when applied, are going to win the day. Yeah. I think they're going to be the best for human flourishing. Yeah. And so that's what I would push for. But there's some of these areas where it's like we need to do work as Christians to figure out what the biblical principle is. Yeah. How does it apply to this?
Yeah. Let me jump in here a little bit in terms on what I think about when I'm voting. And you seem to spend a lot more time on this stuff than me, so I want you to correct me if you think you see something. Literally, I'm open to that. But when I'm looking at a candidate, number one, I told you, I think trajectory. I think...
Of the candidate or the country?
Country.
Okay.
I think which candidate is going to help the church progress in its mission to disciple the nation. And what's that?
This could get sticky.
Right. And so when I think, it seems to me that between the two candidates right now, Trump would be much more in favor of the church than Biden would. At least when he was in office. The language, the freedoms that he gave. I think Biden during COVID, putting the restrictions that he did, and the church having to come up with lawsuits and everything else to be able to worship, I think that made me like, that's uncomfortable. Never should the government get involved with the church's worship. Mm-hmm. So I think the freedom for the church to do what it does, because that is ultimately what's going to save our nation. That's number one for me. Number two for me is the trajectory biblically of the family, which now we get into social issues, right? What is marriage? And people think, oh, why do you care about the fact that homosexuals get married? I care because we see what's happened in the last 20, 30 years. That's something that we tolerated, we're then forced to celebrate. Now we have 20% of Gen Z identifying as something else. Now our birth rates are following. The family has been affected by social issues. Mm-hmm. We don't live our lives in a vacuum or a bubble in that I can go be homosexual in the corner and it won't affect everyone else. That's not how people work. So those are big issues for me. And so when I look at the two candidates, right, I'm definitely going to be the one that's more pro-family. Yeah, I think, and then obviously the abortion issue is a big one. I think that is the biggest egregious sin in our country right now. Last I heard, I think we were at 800,000 abortions a year, which is an astronomical number. I do think that we'll look back 50, 100 years from now and be like, how in the world did we all sit idly by while that happened? I think we'll look at it like we do slavery. That's my own opinion. So those are what really grip me in the current state that we're in. What are your thoughts on?
I would agree with the point you're making. I think one thing, maybe the verbiage is what I'm kind of picking up on, and I shouldn't be. But when you talk about trajectory, I guess ultimately I don't care about trajectory because I don't think the president helps the church move forward, period.
You don't think he should or that he does?
I don't think he does. So I think that if we are being faithful to what we've been called to do, right, regardless of whether there's pro-family policies or anti-family policies in office, we are still called to love people, to be a mission to people, to bring them the gospel, and transform our communities so that they are that countercultural culture within our regions and influence on a local level that way.
Well, hold on. Time out. Let me push on you a little bit.
All right.
So, North Korea
Mm-hmm.
has no bearing, their government has no bearing on Christianity being able to spread over there.
I mean, so then we're going to get into a discussion about like what actually spreads the gospel, right? Like,
No, I think
like how does God's kingdom move forward?
We would both agree that nothing is going to stop God's church.
Correct.
Right. We would both agree with that. We both have an optimistic eschatology. But obviously we need to push for a government that allows freedom for the church.
Absolutely.
Right. And I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I guess, and maybe it's just the vocabulary we're
I'm bad at vocabulary.
tripped up on here. But I would say absolutely we need to fight for those things and we need to put those people in office.
Yeah.
But I don't care who's in office. I should be doing those things regardless.
100%.
Right? And
I don't like you said. Sorry, I don't like that verbiage either, though. We have to care who's in office.
yeah, I know. I throw I don't care out a lot. There's a whole mess of stuff behind that. But
I hear you. I don't put faith or trust there. But I still have a duty as a citizen and as a Christian to put what I believe to be the most biblical option in office.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's what I guess I would, when I say trajectory.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bad word.
Yeah, so I think we agree. I think when you said help the church, that's what I kind of was like.
Yeah.
Like,
we
I don't
have
need
pride in that. We don't need
Trump to help
we
the
don't
church, and I don't need Biden to help the church.
We actually would prefer Trump to not speak for the church at all, if possible.
Yeah, if he just went mute for a
right?
couple
If the guy
years.
would have stayed off of his Twitter, I mean, I feel like he would have went down as a great president.
Yeah, I think it would. It's all perception, right?
Yeah.
The people that don't like Trump, it's a perception issue.
Yeah.
Because if you actually look at what he did, almost anyone I've ever talked to that had an issue with Trump, it's always his mouth, his tone, what he says, not what he does.
Right.
And that is an aspect I think you have to take into consideration. Like, I don't think you can just dismiss, somebody's personality and their personal fitment for the role.
Yeah.
But I also think that is diminished more and more the crazier things get.
Yeah.
So,
All right, here's a hard question for you.
Yeah.
If you're the lead pastor of a church right now, do you feel an obligation to help them think through, and I know we're doing this right now, to help them think through or even possibly tell them who you think they should vote for?
absolutely.
Really?
Oh, for sure. That's not unequivocal.
Well, listen, you're in a spot right now. You're not the pastor of this church.
Yeah.
Tell them, who should they vote for?
So, and this might be culturally, like, I feel weird even saying who you should vote for.
Right.
I would just say, as a Christian, when you look at the policies, you should vote for a pro-life, pro-human flourishing, pro-economic Western culture candidate. Because all the stuff that I've already talked about, like, I think a lot of times people go, economics, what's that have to do with the gospel? Like, that's why I laid out the economic side of it already.
Yep.
It's like there is a common grace that comes from a biblical economic.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a human flourishing that comes from it. So for me, I would say you absolutely should talk about, I think that the church should talk about laws that are on the books. You should talk about your legislature. You should talk about the things that are going on. You should be motivating and pushing your church to be involved in county boards and all these things so that we actually can influence things for the purposes of human flourishing and spreading the gospel and reflecting the fact that the reason these things work is because God is in control and God created it. And God says this is the best way for human flourishing to happen.
Amen.
So when we follow it, all human beings are better off. Full stop.
Okay, well, Dr. Nuance, you didn't say it yet, though.
What am I supposed to say? Who I would vote for?
Yeah, who do you think as a Christian?
This is why I'm hesitant to say you should go vote for Trump.
I didn't say I wanted you to say that.
I know I'm saying it, but
Okay.
to me, Trump's the only option of the two parties.
Right.
Okay.
But you have a hard time saying as a Christian you should go vote. Like that
Yeah.
language is difficult.
And this is because I'm sketchy too about
Right.
like voting for Trump. Like,
But at the same time, the reality is we have two options.
correct.
You have Biden or you have Trump.
Well, you have more than two options, but two options that can win,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I think that's one thing I disagree with people on is I don't behoove somebody who wants to vote for a different option than those
No,
two.
absolutely not.
So if you want to vote for RFK Jr. as an independent, if you want to vote for a write-in,
Yeah.
I don't play the like
The only-
lesser of two evils thing.
The only argument there, though, is, are you contributing to hurting the better candidate of the two that will inevitably be president? Right? Because if we had a bunch of what we would consider based Christians vote for their ideal candidate that wasn't one of the two options, it's going to really hurt, and we're going to end up with Biden as president again.
So back to Alan Keyes. I heard somebody asked him this one time when he was running for president, and they were like, "There's no chance in you winning. You're clearly the Christian candidate.
Yeah.
There's no chance of you winning this election, though. So why should Christians vote for you? Because it might open up this other candidate to get in." And his response was something that just stuck with me for years. I mean, this was 10 years ago probably, and I'm probably not going to do it justice when I say it, but he basically said something to the effect of, my problem is people that would say that are also the same people that were clamoring for Barabbas to be released instead of Jesus. And he unpacked it way better than I would be able to. But his point was, there's right and wrong, and sometimes we can make ourselves seem really important by coming up with reasons why we can vote for the thing that's not the actual right thing. And that has always kind of stuck with me, and since then I've just never played the like worst of two candidates.
That's good.
So like if Rand Paul was running right now as I don't know, the constitutional candidate, I might.
Right.
It would be a discussion I would have with myself.
But you'd still say you see the argument of.
Yeah, it's a pragmatic argument.
Right.
I don't like
Right.
pragmatics, but
Right.
I'm too black and white for,
Are
a,
you-
for a nuanced guy.
You are good at nuance. I bet your elder meetings, they hate you for that, don't they?
No comment.
I know how that is in my elder meetings. I'm like, oh, you're that guy. No, it can be helpful, for real. Are you willing to say who you're voting for?
I mean, at this point, I'm voting for Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, barring nothing crazy happens or,
Right.
I mean, he could come out tomorrow and flip on any one of the policies we talked about, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I definitely wouldn't vote for Biden.
Right.
But I could definitely see myself voting for a third-party option if I had to.
Yeah.
If Trump went off the rails. So that's why I also don't early vote,
Yeah.
because I think there's a social cohesion we kind of miss with early voting or like mail-in.
Yeah.
And I understand for elderly and people that can't get out, but there's a social aspect of voting that I think we've kind of lost when it's not this one thing we go do together. You see your neighbors like down at the courthouse or at the school where you're voting. Mm-hmm. You can have conversations. There's an aspect culturally I think we're losing with that too. But not even in politics, we're losing that period. Like people don't know their neighbors. People don't have a sense of community.
No, that's good. Well, anything you want to like end with that we didn't talk about?
I mean, for me, I think the thing to take away from going into this election cycle is, one, it's going to be crazy.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I've heard people use the Trump derangement syndrome, but there's derangement on both sides. Yeah. And so I think as a Christian, you need to approach the political season kind of as that boat with an anchor, right? where,
And your anchor is not your party,
correct, your anchor is
nor your candidate.
Jesus.
Yeah.
It's the Bible.
Yeah.
It's God's promises. It's
Yeah.
the hope. It's the principles.
Yeah.
It's so that when you feel those waves of Republican and Democrat and Trump and Biden and your coworker and your neighbor and your spouse or whatever it is, that you can respond to it in a biblical way
Yeah.
where you've thought through it, you know where you're at, you know where God is at in this whole process, you know that He's in control, and that does not abdicate you from fighting, though. And I think that's sometimes what we construe that as, is like, well, God's in control, so we don't have to fight to change this, and we don't have to, right? And so I don't want Christians to hear that either.
Yeah.
I think we do have an obligation to
Yeah.
fight for laws and politicians that are going to push godly laws into place to further the kingdom,
Yep.
to further human flourishing, and to just create a Christian society in the sense of honoring the one who created
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah. I'm probably going to end with something really clear. I actually said it from the pulpit a couple of weeks ago. Probably got myself in a little bit of trouble, but I do that every once in a while. But I felt it was necessary. I would say, and I don't know that you would disagree, maybe you would, that long gone are the days where I think a faithful biblical Christian can vote for the Democratic Party. That's a really big statement, but in the current cultural climate that we're in, I just don't know how you do that with a clear conscience. So,
Yep.
in the midst of what you said, there are other candidates that I can get behind. But this is coming from as a pastor, I just don't see, when you see somebody on his Twitter account every day pushing for the murdering of unborn children as like a primary thing he's running on. How?
Well, especially now that the facade's kind of fallen off.
Right.
So we're roughly the same age. When I was growing up, nobody wanted abortion. Like it was always what was it? Safe, legal, and rare, I think was like the motto.
Yeah.
From the left.
Yep.
That facade, for the most part, has been dropped.
Yep.
And to the point now where you'll have articles in Vogue or Mary Claire where they literally will go, so what if it's a human? I have the right to kill it. And so that facade of like, we could at least kind of get along because you're at least saying what you need to say.
Well, and that's
for the most part, that's gone.
And it's blatant evil. Like there's a lot of nuance in policy, right? And I think that sometimes, hey, how exactly do we wrestle with this economic issue? Like there's some nuance there that I would probably say I don't know which one's right, but I would call both of them not sinful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But we're talking about blatant sin and an evil behind something when you're getting up in there and saying, I need to be able to kill my child if I want to. And so that's where I'm like, the conviction as a pastor, I'll probably get a lot of flack for it, but I'm convicted in that. Like I don't know how you do that as a Christian. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment behind what you're saying. And for me, if I was a pastor at a church, I would say, and if you are one of those people, I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Because I want to understand where you're getting, right? And so I don't want it to seem like I'm telling you, go jump off a cliff if you don't believe this, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying, here's a truth that I believe, and if you are having trouble believing this, or you're on the other side of this, don't walk away, don't leave, come to me.
Yeah.
I want to dialogue with you about this.
Yep.
I want to walk through this and understand where you're coming from.
Yep.
And I think that is a helpful posture for a Christian. Like one of the things that happens down at the drawing room all the time is I'll have atheists and agnostics, and I'll have everybody under the sun. They'll be like, "You're the first Christian I've ever been able to like talk about this stuff, and you don't get upset." Like, or you won't just quote Bible verses.
Yeah.
To
Well,
me,
what I notice about people that are on the left, and I've had a lot of conversations. I've got a good buddy that's a physicist up at Iowa, and we are just constantly. back and forth. And he's a really loving dude. And the facade that a lot of people on the left see as an appeal to that side is the empathy, emotional, help for the poor. Even abortion is painted in the light of a woman that was taken advantage of, raped, now has no other option. She's poor, right? It's this whole facade of like taking care of the marginalized. But the bigger issue, it's not fleshed out, right? They're not painting the entire picture.
Yeah, I just think it's not being in alignment with your principles most of the time. Here's the perfect example. I know we're trying to land the ship, but
Yeah, no, you're fine.
War.
Yeah.
There is nothing that will destroy human flourishing faster than war, right? War does not care if you are a man or a woman or a child.
Yeah.
Like, it is indiscriminate in its destruction of humanity.
Yep.
And I actually think that's one of the things that flipped this paradigm with Trump, is that he was like the first Republican who was like, no, I'm not that keen on going to war, and I don't plan on going to war.
The guy went and became like besties with Putin and stuff. It wasn't, I don't know what he was saying, but it was incredible.
Yeah. So for me, it's like, that's another tweak in the political spectrum is like, I remember every Saturday by Best Buy in Moline, there would be 10 to 20 protesters of the Iraq War under George W. Bush. And this is 100% factual because I drove by it every Saturday.
Yeah.
As soon as Obama became president, they were all gone. There were no more war protesters on that corner by Best Buy. And it's like, well, why? Like, I think Christians, whenever possible, should be against war. I'm not saying there aren't reasons for war.
Yeah.
But that is such an atomic bomb to human flourishing,
Right.
that all of the other conversations socially are minuscule to that. I mean, look at the death toll in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
Now, you could make the argument that, well, the way that should get resolved is we should end the war and we should stop it. That's still going to lead to more death.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, that's more human beings dying.
Yep.
So, yeah, we'll end the ship on that one, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me today, bro.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great.
We covered a lot. We could probably talk for 3 more hours, but
I thought we were going Joe Rogan style, 4 hours, you know.
I don't know if I have that in me. I need like people handing me drinks and stuff and snacks like he does.
Yeah, I'm like, man, this water just isn't cutting it.
But appreciate it and love you, Rock Church, and we'll talk to you guys soon.